All right. Well, good morning, Austin. We are back for round two with your second book. Uh, thanks for reaching out and thanks for thinking about us for the podcast and for the interview to talk about your second book.
Aaron, it's no trouble at all, and thank you very much for having me.
So, book number two. So, I think last time we talked, you were actually already had in mind your second book. So how long has this taken to put together? Because it doesn't seem like it's been that long.
It's funny. I think it depends on where you want to start measuring from, naturally enough. But I think essentially what happened was on the heels of putting out the first book, I started receiving outreach from some different Blue Lodges and other Masonic bodies asking me to come and join them as a speaker. And it's so funny because I think in my mind, when I pictured this kind of activity, I imagined things being kind of uniform, and it was definitely not the case. And different places that I was going had different needs and expectations. And very, very simply put, different lodges and bodies wanted presentations of different lengths. And I felt like I could accommodate them. I thought one thing that worked especially well, there were four essays out of that first book, More Light, that seemed like put together, they covered some good Blue Lodge fundamentals. Now I'm gonna mess this up off the top of my head, I bet. But there were four. One was about um, caring for each other. One was about being gentlemen. One was about religious tolerance, and one was about trying to understand how to address politics, but in a civil, level-headed manner. And each of those papers, because they were originally produced as articles for a magazine, they were all somewhat uniform length. But if you put the four of those together, it took about a half hour to present, and that seemed to work well for several of the Blue Lodges. But a handful of places, a symposium that I presented at, a Scottish Rite Valley that I presented at, were really looking for something more in depth. So I started writing some longer material, and just in the course of that 2 years, since I put that first book out, and it crossed my mind that that material could really stand on its own as a new book. That germ was in my mind from pretty early on, but it took a while to compose the material that I thought was suitable and belonged there. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can totally see that because I know when we've had speakers at my lodge in Southern California, a lot of times we kind of have to give them an idea of, are you going to be the main speaker and it's going to be a fellowship night, or are we asking you to come in and speak, during dinner before a meeting? So do you have 15, 20 minutes, or do you have as long as you need?
I really appreciate you expressing that from your end, right? As the person who schedules speakers, because this is a two-way street, and it was just another interesting lesson to derive out of this activity was how important communication is, and everybody trying to be as clear and upfront as possible, trying to get all of the details out on the table so that we manage expectations, right? So that we really understand each other. So it's all been full of interesting learning experiences. I got to tell you that much.
Yeah, it was funny because I just had a flashback of we had a speaker come in once and to do the Legend of Prince Hall. And we set it up as a Masonic education night. We literally thought this was going to be like an hour, hour and a half, and he was done in 15 minutes. It was like, oh, wow. Okay, so lesson learned is, find out all this information ahead of time because we could have done that during dinner and then had a different speaker or done something else for the main meeting.
Exactly. And it's just like I hesitate to point fingers at, I don't want to say that somebody is to blame. It's just that both parties kind of drop the ball in some cases. And the more that we make sure that all of the details are covered and we understand each other, the better chance we have of avoiding hiccups just like that.
Yeah, exactly. So book two, Black
Yeah.
Ink, Farther Stars. So I know you told me a little bit about it, but why don't you explain for the audience, like where did you get the title from?
So the title comes from two experiences that I had in the course of a couple of weeks, like kind of one right on the heels of the other. And I almost want to read to you straight from the introduction, but I'm thinking maybe in the interest of time, I'll try to condense a little instead. Um, but what it boils down to is I went with my girlfriend and some members of her family to this beautiful astronomical observatory that we have in the Pittsburgh area, and it's affiliated with University of Pittsburgh. Um, so they had a qualified and educated fellow from their department giving the tour of this facility. And he was giving us a little talk about how they make use of the telescopes and the equipment available to them. So he was telling us a little bit about parallax. Um, and to abbreviate a little bit, parallax is a property of geometry used to look at objects at a great distance, make two observations of them when you are in two different positions on the face of the earth at two different times of year. And by making these two separate observations, you're able to make an estimate of the distance to that object. I had heard of this concept before. I really loved the way that this guy laid it out clearly and simply for a broad audience of people. Like the people attending this tour, there were young kids, there were older adults, with different levels of their own education and experience. But he spelled this out really nice and clearly for us. And gee, I'm trying to figure out how much longer. Oh, it was only a couple of days later. I was reading a post in the Facebook group called Esoteric Freemasonry for Thoughtful Men and Women. And at that Facebook page, someone had shared a YouTube video that was produced by the Harvard Divinity School. The lecturer in the video was a Professor Wouter Hanegraaff from the University of Amsterdam. And he was giving a lecture about theurgy in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. Theurgy is engaging in spiritual practices that are intended to give you a direct and personal experience with your deity. Like not just a vibe or sensation of being in their presence, but like so personal it's almost that it borders on being able to speak with them and have them speak back to you. And he was explaining that in a lot of academic literature, some of the details of the practices that ancient people engaged in order to make these direct experiences possible get kind of blipped over a little bit because it ventures into what some people might consider some pretty sketchy territory. And I'll explain a little bit better. He talked about a practice that people engaged in where they made an ink out of a leaf of a plant called contritus, and they would mix it with honey and with myrrh, which we've all heard of from the New Testament maybe. They would
Mm-hmm.
they would make an ink out of this mixture. They would write a prayer on a leaf, right? And then they would lick the prayer off of the leaf. So you remember, right? You've taken these several ingredients, you've
Yeah.
mashed them up into an ink, you've written the prayer, and then they lick the prayer off of the leaf. And then they go on to have this very direct and personal spiritual experience. Why is it that this following these specific steps and instructions might make that spiritual experience possible? Well, it turns out that the contritus has psychoactive properties. So the people following the recipe, following the important steps of the ritual, reliably end up having the experience, while the people involved in creating the ritual may have had the insight and knowledge that the vegetables they were using in the ingredients composing this ink had psychoactive properties, which were going to stimulate the user's imagination, and they were going to have this profound spiritual experience. So as I'm listening to this lecture in this YouTube video, um, I don't know, the two concepts just kind of collided in my head. And I thought about consuming the ink that has these properties as a metaphor for our research, right? When we read, when we absorb subject matter, we are consuming the ink. And then we are able to engage our intellectual faculties, like the lecturer at the observatory explained to us about parallax, to make observations about subjects farther and farther distant from us, but able to capture the relevant information thanks to following our ritual and absorbing this information. Black ink,
That's pretty cool.
farther stars.
Yeah.
That's where it derives from.
Yeah. So now we just need to follow that same recipe and then study our ritual again and then have 3 points.
Ah, triangulating. Who knows? Who knows? It might be possible, Aaron. Who knows?
Wow, that's pretty good. That's really cool. I had never heard that before. That's very interesting. So now I'm gonna have to track that down and watch that video.
Yeah, and if it helps any, like I spelled out the details pretty thoroughly in the intro to the book to enable people to look it up again.
Wow, that's really cool. So let's see. So you have what do you get? 5 chapters. So before we get into what the chapters are, so was there a theme among the chapters of the book? Is there an overall theme?
I will admit that I went into kind of a potpourri mode again here, right? There's a eclectic mix of different subject matter. There's some stuff going on here that's sort of straight ahead history, like the chapter that's about Allied Masonic degrees and Grand College of Rites. It's basically talking about branches of the Masonic organization and saying, here are the people who were involved in making these organizations and these rituals possible. Here's the dates when they were active. Here's the countries they were working in, and here's what they did, right? There's other chapters, like another chapter, the one about the physical properties of the Old Testament is really leaning more on your Old Testament or your Torah, which, is it, it is our volume of the sacred law for, those of us of the Jewish faith. I am not here to dictate to somebody else whether they take this as fact or whether they take it as lore, but it is, it is the religious code that I adhere to. But there's so much of that content that's also in Blue Lodge Masonry and the other branches as well, honestly, that I thought exploration of the Old Testament could be something that would enrich our grasp and understanding of our Masonic ritual. And then there's a subject, a chapter like Chamber of Reflection, where I just dove a little bit deeper into esoterica. It draws on poetry, philosophy, alchemy, a lot of different subject matter combined to look at something that's a little bit more philosophical, maybe a little bit farther out on the fringes of our experience.
Hmm.
So I'll admit, I didn't stick to one genre or subject matter here. I was a little all over the map. I find that some people like that sort of thing. I know I do. So that's what I did.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious. I mean, I read a lot of short stories and stuff like that, and sometimes it's interesting, you might think that sometimes some of the books yeah, there's an overarching theme, but then other ones it's like everything is just so different. Yeah, and as I was reading the titles and the chapters, I was like, wow, that's definitely kind of all over. So on
Guilty as
the
charged.
so the stuff Freemasonry is made of. So let's see. You talk about physical settings and artifacts. So, what are a couple of artifacts, without giving away the book or the whole chapter, but what are a couple of the artifacts maybe that you could talk about that tie in with Freemasonry?
Okay, so if we're looking specifically at artifacts, we could talk for a minute, for instance, about the high priest's breastplate, right? Uh, we hear this spoken about in the York Rite. We even see it as part of the robing, right? The high
Hmm.
priest's breastplate had 12 gemstones in it to represent the tribes of Israel. For some of the gemstones, when they are listed in the Hebrew in the Old Testament, the translation is clear. It's been handed down generationally, and we know what stones they were talking about. for one of the stones, a proper translation has never definitively been agreed upon. Um, so this kind of then sparks people's imagination. What substance could they have been talking about? I covered that topic. Um, but separate from the individual artifacts, I thought that some of the more interesting contents in that chapter got more into the materials. So
Uh-huh.
I talked a little bit about the acacia, right? We reference acacia plenty in our Blue Lodge or our Craft Lodge. But have you seen one? Do you know what they look like? Did you know that they have a fragrance? So what it means is that if somebody used this part, do you know what the properties of the wood is, and in what applications it would have been used in ancient times? So if we know that it was something that had some properties that were considered good for external cladding, almost like siding, then you can imagine that you would have had entire chambers in the temple that would have had this lumber used throughout, and it would have been giving off a fragrance, so that scripture might talk a lot about what Solomon's temple looked like, but imagine the idea that as you approached it, there was also a fragrance. This was a multi-sensory experience, and we don't hear this talked about very often.
No, and
Um,
what just flashed into my head was like you hear the tall cedars of Lebanon, and we know cedar has a distinct smell to it.
sure, yes, absolutely. The other subject that I touched on in that chapter pretty thoroughly is the concept of the blue and purple dye, right? Um,
Hmm.
a lot of emphasis is placed on the importance of these colors, and you may even be exposed before your involvement or your membership in Freemasonry to the concept that purple was sometimes used to designate royalty. Why might that association have been made? It turns out that these pigments, these hues, were actually very difficult to produce and therefore made them more costly to come by. Why were they so difficult to produce? The substances could only be made from a particular snail. Well, have we ever identified biologically what that snail was? Could we ever reproduce this pigment? I'm not going to spoil the exciting conclusions, but this is some of the stuff I covered in that chapter.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't that the whole thing in the Roman times? Is the emperor was the only one allowed to wear the purple robe?
And similar requirements or prohibitions are found in other neighboring cultures there in the Mediterranean, and we can identify the reason why.
Wow, that's awesome. So, chamber of reflection. So, at your local lodge, do you guys utilize the chamber of reflection?
We do not have an entire chamber of reflection yet. We encourage some of the same meditation and practices, but I know it's something that's being discussed with a lot of interest all throughout the state. I am hopeful that it could change in my lifetime. In the meantime, we don't have one yet.
That's interesting. My lodge in Southern California, we actually, I want to say in the last year, they actually set one up. And I mean, it's really cool just to look at it, of the whole concept of have the candidate, sit there and just kind of contemplate before their initiation, before their first degree.
Absolutely.
And so is this basically this chapter kind of on how others do it and kind of the use of it, or is there something else involved in this chapter?
Well, what it starts with is discussing some of the symbols that, you know, historically, typically have been utilized in the chamber of reflection. So, for better or for worse, that's not a tightly held secret as we might suppose or we might like. That kind of information is available. But then I extrapolated a little bit further from that. So, in other words, what are the symbols being utilized in the chamber? What are they supposed to summon to mind for the candidate who is meditating on them? And then what are some other cultural touchstones that enhance or inform our experience of this meditation, this contemplation of our own mortality? So I got into some other references from history and literature. Um, I think even people who are already familiar with the chamber will find something to expand and enlighten their appreciation and their understanding of the subject in this chapter.
I think, to me, that's one of the things with masonry just in general, right? I mean, I find that I constantly will, and maybe it's just a matter of your brain catches something or you focus on something a little different, but I'll be listening to a lecture, or maybe I'm the one giving a lecture or a talk, and all of a sudden you like stop, you're like, wow, I just realized that, or I just realized this, and I never really thought about that before.
You know, it's funny that you should mention that because in all of this activity, like I'm a person who enjoys public speaking. I'm a pretty social guy. The folks listening to this podcast who hear me say it may even give a chuckle because it might be a touch of an understatement. I enjoy meeting new people. I enjoy visiting new lodges. Um, but the aspect of all this activity that really just tickles me pink is the research. And when you stumble across something new or you fall down that rabbit hole and find a resonance or an association that you weren't even aware of before, um, that's it, man. Like the thrill of the chase right there, that's super enjoyable.
Yeah, that's awesome. I agree. It's funny, in a way, you inspired me on your first book. And so I edit our newsletter for my lodge in Southern California. And I typically, as the editor, I always have an editor's page. And I usually take the theme of whatever the master has chosen for the theme for that month. But sometimes I kind of go off on a tangent. But what I've started doing is taking every one of those articles that I've done and I'm putting it now into just one document so that I can go back and kind of review it and potentially, take some of those and then just expand on them and start doing more research and maybe turn those eventually into a book myself.
Aaron, I find that super exciting. I mean, there are few things more rewarding than realizing that my efforts to do this stuff have inspired and motivated anybody else to venture outside their comfort zone a little bit and try something. I know that like I heard a correspondence from one fella on the heels of putting out the first book, who reached out to me and he said, Austin, I've been thinking about joining Freemasonry for years, and I was really on the fence about it for a while. And knowing that you discussed and promoted your book as something that was digestible and understandable both to people who were already members and people who were not, I went out and I bought a copy. And having read it, I kind of got inspired to get off my duff, and I have now petitioned a lodge. And I mean that feeling, um, that just that was such a heartwarming thing. It was so gratifying to know that I had impacted somebody that way. So if you wind up collecting your stuff and publishing it, I would just be excited as heck.
Well, well, I'm not going to say if when I get to that point, because like I said, I've started it. When I get to that point, you will be one of the first to know.
That's terrific.
So let's see. The other one, I think, so your other chapter that I had, it's kind of funny. It kind of made me giggle because I was like, it's amazing how you just tie things together. So the tarot of virtue. So,
Yes.
so what made you, like, what drove that thought or of driving, tarot and tarot cards into the book?
It's actually simpler and more straightforward than you might expect. But what it boils down to is there is a fella who is now a past master at my traditional observance lodge, Lodge Ad Lucem number 812, a fellow by the name of Max Hammer. And he did a presentation series based on a book that he had read called A Small Treatise on the Great Virtues by a contemporary philosopher by the name of Andre Comte Sponville. a French fella. And Sponville uh, kind of generated this list or this system of 18 virtues. And for the most part, he started with what he considers the simplest or most foundational, and then other ones that grow from, that proceed from the simpler, so that maybe we can only learn some of the more sophisticated ones by first mastering the more basic ones. It maybe in our youth, starting with ones that are more basic, and then only growing in our capacity for virtue. As he was doing this presentation series and listing them, um, folks who are already interested in or fond of tarot will not be surprised to find that some of those virtues that he listed, I recognized as explicitly being the titles of tarot cards, and that were supposed to be illustrated by those cards. Now, let me grab the book so that I should not misspeak. So if you look at temperance, or if you look at justice, um, it jumps out at you quickly that these virtues are the titles of tarot cards, and we can even those of us who have worked with them, even those images leap to mind immediately when you hear those words.
Yeah.
But as Max continued in his presentation series, it crossed my mind that even the virtues that he listed from Sponville's system that were not explicitly already the titles of tarot cards, it dawned on me that some of the symbolism that I could recall somewhat seemed to correspond to the virtues that he was listing. And as time went on and I continued this contemplation, I realized that there were more and more correspondences. So I started writing up this paper.
Wow. Oh, that's good. So I've already made a note to myself. I'm going to have to pull up a list of a deck of tarot cards on the internet and take a look at them all and see how many of them I can just immediately obviously like temperance and justice. You're like, okay, as a Mason, those have a very special place for me. So
Yeah,
that'll be
and
cool.
listen, I want to address this. I want to talk about the elephant in the room, right? Because I recognize that there are Masons who are very curious and interested in what the subject matter that we slap the label of esoterica onto, and there are Masons who cringe and shy away from it. And I recognize that and I respect it. Different strokes for different folks. But I do want to point out that the research that I did and the paper that I wrote is not focused on the notion, whether you believe it or not, about trying to utilize tarot cards for divination, foretelling the future, or anything of the sort. All I was trying to address was this idea that when you look at the illustrations, and this is a specific illustrator, I should point out, right? There was a deck that was commissioned by A.E. Waite, and he utilized the services of an artist by the name of Pamela Coleman Smith. And so it's her illustrations that I was focusing on, only because honestly, it's the deck that's like the most familiar to me, and probably familiar to a ton of other people. So just to circle back here, I was only emphasizing the idea that these illustrations and symbols that were utilized in the tarot could be used as a study guide or a memory aid for approaching this system of 18 virtues, not trying to utilize them for anything mystical or anything of that nature. And I hope that that's something that might put people's mind at ease who might otherwise be leery of this subject matter. There's nothing spooky about it.
Well, and you mentioned about the esoterica, and yeah, and I mean, I think about the conversations I've had with people, and there's a lot of people in Masonry like you and Worshipful Carlos Diaz, who's our inspector, who are just so into the esoteric and have gone in and studied Kabbalah and the different mysticisms and stuff, and just are able to tie this all in. And then of course then there's Masons that it's kind of like, well, what do you enjoy most about it? I like that I go Thursday nights and I got a bunch of guys to hang out with. And what
Yeah, but
else? That's it. That's what I love. I love having a bunch of good guys that I can hang out with.
yeah, and I mean, to me, the kind of terminology I would use here, though, is that Freemasonry is a big tent. It's a big tent, and I think there's room for those guys and for me, uh, under the same tent, right? Because I enjoy the same things that they do, honestly. Like, I love getting together with everybody. I love, the fact that we're there together at the lodge. I love the fact that we're, outside smoking a pipe or a cigar after the lodge. I love kibitzing with everybody. But I think that, shoot, there's a real old legend about, I want to say it's like five blind men and an elephant, right? And as they're approaching the elephant, they put out their hands to grasp it, to try to understand what an elephant might be because they've never experienced one before. And the one touches the leg and he feels around its circumference and he says, "Oh, an elephant is a thing very much like a tree." And another one puts his hand against the elephant's flank and he runs his hand side to side and realizes that this thing just extends on in both directions. And he says, "Oh, an elephant is a thing like a wall." And one guy happens to grasp the trunk, and the trunk is wriggling all around, and he lurches back, startled, and he goes, "Oh, an elephant is a thing like a snake." And the thing is, the elephant is all of those things, right?
Yeah,
I think there's
exactly.
enough room for all of us in Freemasonry who find different things appealing, because truly Freemasonry is actually all of those things.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I love about it is that it, if you are going in looking for mysticism, you'll find it. If you're going in looking for fellowship and brotherhood, you'll find it. If you're going in and you're looking for a way to get away from your family on a Thursday night, you'll find it.
True that.
Let's see. We're coming down to time here shortly, but ritual across time and space. So my question on that is that your longest chapter or just kind of tie in? Because so I'm going through the Mackey's Revised History of Freemasonry, and almost the first two books are almost completely about that and about the different types of rituals that have just across time have been used to you know promote lessons.
Understood. Well, I'll tell you something. This one is actually not the longest chapter in the book, but it's also not focused mainly on Masonic ritual either. This chapter is more about how different cultures in different countries throughout history have used ritual as part of their moral instruction for the public, right? Um, and I mean, I think we consider it, somewhat when as we sit in Blue Lodge, because particularly because we're listening to lectures. But I think that you see it differently if for instance, you join like Scottish Rite and like Larry from Masonic Light podcast likes to refer to the Scottish Rite degrees as the plays, right? Um, but it's very theatrical. And I wrote this article for Pennsylvania Council of Deliberation, which is a aggregate body of Scottish Rite valleys throughout our state here in Pennsylvania. And this was to talk to ritual directors. And the idea was to just share with them some of the variety and the nuance of the way that different cultures throughout history have used theater and performing arts to instruct and to teach moral lessons.
Yeah. And I think that's, man, maybe I didn't explain it right, but that's one of the things in the Mackey book is they talk about where people have said, oh, Masonry came from this. And they go back and they say, well, not necessarily. They were doing some of the same things and using these types of performing arts and things to show different rituals. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where Masonry came from. I mean, it's been used,
Right.
many, because when people don't know how to read and they're practically illiterate, the best way to show them is in a performance art type of event. And
I
then,
apologize for missing your point, but I wholeheartedly agree. So I'm not going to try to stack myself up against Brother Mackey. If somebody's looking for reading material, he's not a bad way to go either.
no,
But
not at
I
all.
will say that I certainly enjoyed composing this one very much. You see things in earlier history in England, but you see similar things happen in hula from Hawaii. You see things happen in voodoo from Haiti. You see things happen among the Hopi Native Americans here, in the continental U.S. With their practice with the kachina. So I was just trying to draw out some interesting examples and parallels that I thought uh, would resonate with people, both in terms of what was familiar and what they hadn't been exposed to before.
So that's great. And I'm not sure where all you got your research from, but if you haven't like looked through the Mackey books, literally like the first book and a half go through just so many variations of things like that, back to ancient Egypt. And I mean, just there's so many different, religions and just philosophical schools that they talk through of different degrees and different things where you can see how somebody would have thought, oh, that's where masonry came from because they had like 3 degrees. Well, no, they had 3 lessons and they had 3 type of theaters that they did, but it's not masonry.
Right on, right on.
Cool. So we're about at time. So for the last couple of minutes, why don't you let everybody know kind of a recap on the name, where it can be found, who your publisher is, and where we can send people to go get it.
No trouble at all. So this is the new book, Black Ink Farther Stars. It is currently available on Amazon, and it's available on Amazon internationally. So if you look at Amazon.com as we use in the US, you'll find it here. But if you live in the UK and your website is amazon.co.uk, you'll find it there. The book currently is available only in paperback format and only at Amazon. That is because I used Kindle Direct Publishing. So there is no publishing house this time around. It's self-published. Did it all myself. That was an exciting venture. And Aaron, if you're looking to go in that direction further on down the line, let me know because I'd like to give you some tips and tricks that might save you a lot of headache and heartache.
All right. So
Oh,
how about the prior book?
yeah, if people happen to be interested in finding more light, collected Masonic writings 2017 to 2021, that can be found at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Google Play, and other places that you find either print or ebooks. So that's available both as paperback, hardcover, and ebook. So that's a little bit more broadly available. If they're looking for the first book, but it's certainly not a real requirement or anything because the two books aren't sequential, separate subject matter, all of which I hope people will find interesting. And there's that.
All right. So I haven't looked, but I was going to look it up right now. So the cover of your book.
Yes.
So the new cover, where did the cover come from?
Well, I'm real excited about how that came out. I can't take full credit for it. I tracked down these elements that I knew I wanted to use. I wanted to be able to see that sky that's transitioning from the daytime sky into the nighttime as a reference to the whole, astronomy aspect I was discussing from the title and from the intro. And that nifty little graphic in the center, um, that is from a medieval illustration, an astronomer accused of sorcery holding a disc with magic figures from the 13th century. I just stumbled across that little fella while searching around on the internet for images. But I have to give credit where credit is due to my brother Jeremy McKnight, who is a graphic designer who actually put the elements together for me and formatted it so that I could submit it to Amazon for the cover. And I want to thank him from the bottom of my heart for his terrific work.
It looks great. I just pulled it up and I was going to see what you had put on there because especially when you mentioned it was self-published. So that's why I was like, I got to see what he did for the cover then.
Right on.
So, all right. Well, Austin, thank you again. And I just realized I do have your phone number. So, as time goes on, I'm sure we'll be keeping in touch. So, thank you so much for reaching out and for your time. And I'm actually going to go through and kind of review this today and see if I can't get this podcast out later on today.
Aaron, no need to thank me. Thank you so much for your time and for helping me try to share this with people. I just hope it's something that's going to, inspire and motivate people and that they will enjoy reading it.
All right. Thank you again, my friend, my brother. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too, sir.
All right. Thanks. Bye bye.